My son stopped smiling before he finished unfolding the paper. The room was still warm from cinnamon and pine. My grandchildren were cross-legged on the rug, whispering over batteries and plastic packaging. Christmas music hummed softly from the kitchen speaker. It was the kind of morning your wife would have called perfect. Daniel's hand slowed as he reached the last page. He didn't look at me at first. He read it again, then a third time, Dad. His voice lost its footing somewhere between confusion and calculation. Across from him, Melissa leaned forward. What is it? Daniel swallowed. The color in his face drained in a way I hadn't seen since he was a boy, caught in a lie he couldn't talk his way out of. He turned the document slightly as if hoping the angle might change what it said. It didn't. The children kept playing. They didn't notice the shift, how the air had thickened, how the room had quietly rearranged itself. Is this real? He asked. I took a sip of coffee before answering. Yes, his jaw tightened. He flipped to the signature page. My signature. The notary seal. The date, 3 days ago. Melissa stood now. Daniel, what is it? He didn't answer her. He was staring at the line that bore his company's name. The company he'd built. The company he believed he owned outright. Or the house deed attached behind it, depending on which page had caught his eye first. Dad, he said again, softer this time. Not angry, not yet. Just unsteady. Why would you? I met his eyes, calmly. You said I couldn't afford Christmas this year, I reminded him. No one spoke after that. Outside, a car passed slowly over the frozen street. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked. The tree lights blinked steadily, indifferent to the silence. 3 weeks earlier, my son had looked at me across my own kitchen table and told me, gently, almost kindly, that I didn't have the money to host Christmas. That was the day I decided there would be one last gift under the tree, and I would let him open it last. Have never needed very much. That used to worry my wife, Ellen. She said I had a talent for mistaking comfort for excess. When we bought this house in 1989, I chose it because the mortgage felt manageable, not because it impressed anyone. 3 bedrooms, a narrow porch, maple tree in the front yard that still drops helicopters every spring. After Ellen passed 8 years ago, the house grew quieter, but it never felt empty. I kept her routines. Coffee at 6. Window cracked an inch, even in winter. Classical station low enough that it didn't interfere with thinking. Retirement came and went without much ceremony. I had stepped back gradually from the business long before I turned 70. Advisory role. Fewer meetings. Eventually none. My days became structured around smaller things. Morning walks. The hardware store clerk who always over-explained light bulbs. Thursday dinners with Daniel's family. I drove the same silver sedan I'd had for 12 years. It started every time. That was enough for me. Daniel used to tease me about it. Dad, you know cars have screens now, right? He'd say, sliding into the passenger seat and looking around like he'd stepped into a museum. I have a radio, I'd reply. It works. He'd shake his head, smiling. He always smiled when he corrected me. I understood how it looked from the outside. I clipped coupons. I kept a handwritten ledger for household expenses. I still compared grocery prices by the ounce. It wasn't necessity, it was habit. The kind formed in your 20s when you're trying to build something that will outlast you. Christmas, though, was the one time I allowed a little extravagance. Not flashy, just deliberate. Ellen had loved hosting. She believed the house felt most alive when it was slightly overcrowded. Every December we moved the dining table against the wall and unfolded the long wooden one from the garage. Daniel would string lights along the banister. Later, when he married Melissa, she brought her gingerbread recipe and rearranged my spice cabinet without asking. Ellen pretended to mind. She didn't. After Ellen died, Daniel offered to host. It's too much for you, Dad, he'd said gently. Let us take it over, but I shook my head. As long as I'm here, Christmas is here. And so it remained. I budgeted for it months in advance, not because I had to, but because I enjoyed the discipline of it. I kept a separate envelope labeled December. I watched sales throughout the year. I listened carefully when the grandchildren mentioned things in passing. Last year it was a telescope for Noah. The year before, a sewing machine for Ava. I never told Daniel what I spent. He never asked. Over the past year, though, I noticed something subtle in him. A new tightness around money. Not fear exactly, more like vigilance. His company had grown quickly. Commercial property management, mid-sized contracts. He spoke about expansion the way young men speak about destiny. Scaling, he called it. There were dinners where he seemed distracted, tapping numbers into his phone while Melissa described school fundraisers. I'd ask how business was. Good, he'd say. Busy. Sometimes he would glance around my kitchen, at the older cabinets, the worn tile, the refrigerator that hummed a little too loudly. You ever think about updating this place? He asked once. It still keeps the food cold, I said. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes that time. I assumed the distance was generational. Success moves quickly now, faster than it did when I was his age. I built things slowly. Daniel builds them aggressively. I admired that about him, even if I didn't always understand it. 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, I invited him over to discuss the usual plans. Same as always? I asked, pouring coffee. He hesitated before answering. Maybe, he said. We'll see. It was the first time Christmas had sounded negotiable. I didn't press him then. I thought perhaps Melissa's family wanted a turn. Or maybe they were simply tired. Life does that. That night after he left, I walked through the house and imagined it decorated. The wreath on the door. Ellen's glass ornaments wrapped carefully in newspaper dated 1994. The long table pulled from the garage. Traditions are fragile things. They don't announce when they're about to disappear. A few days later, Daniel called. Dad, can we talk? He asked. There was a carefulness in his voice I hadn't heard before. Polite, measured. Of course, I said. He suggested we sit down in person. It's about Christmas, he added. I remember looking at the small envelope already labeled December in my desk drawer. I closed the drawer gently. Come by tomorrow, I told him. At the time, I believed we were discussing logistics. I didn't yet understand we were discussing my competence. Daniel arrived the next afternoon precisely at 2. He used to come by without calling. Let himself in. Head straight for the refrigerator. That changed somewhere along the line. Now he knocked. I opened the door before he could ring the bell. Cold out there, I said. Yeah. He stepped inside, brushing his hands together. You keeping the heat up enough? I manage. He gave a tight smile at that and followed me into the kitchen. I had already set out 2 mugs and the good coffee. The one Melissa once said tasted less like regret. Daniel noticed the brand. You don't have to buy the expensive stuff. Dad? It was on sale. He nodded, but his eyes lingered on the label longer than necessary. We sat across from each other at the same oak table where he had done his homework 30 years ago. I waited. I've learned that if you give a man enough silence, he'll eventually fill it with the truth he came to say. He cleared his throat. So, Melissa and I have been talking. That's usually a good sign, I said lightly. He didn't smile. It's about Christmas. I folded my hands around the mug. All right. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, the posture of someone delivering delicate news. Dad, you've done it for years. And we love that, we do. But it's a lot of work, lot of expense. I've managed so far, I know. But things change. There it was, the first shift. Vague, unanchored. In what way? I asked. He hesitated, choosing his words with unusual care. You're retired now. Fixed income. Inflation's up. Groceries alone. He gestured vaguely toward the pantry, as if numbers might spill out of it. I keep track, I said evenly. I'm sure you do. He nodded quickly. And this isn't about you not being responsible. It's just, we don't want you stretching yourself thin for the sake of tradition. I studied him for a moment. His watch was new, subtle but expensive, his coat tailored. He carried himself differently these days, shoulders squared a little higher. And what would you suggest? I asked. We could host this year, he said, relief creeping into his voice now that he'd reached the proposal. Bigger space. Easier for the kids. You wouldn't have to worry about buying all the food, the gifts, decorating. You could just show up. Enjoy it, just show up, I repeated. Yeah, he nodded again. Take the pressure off. I let a small silence settle between us. You think I feel pressured? I asked. He exhaled. Dad, I just don't think you can afford Christmas this year. He said it gently, almost kindly. But kindness doesn't soften a sentence like that. It only disguises it. I didn't respond immediately. I watched the steam curl from my coffee and disappear. I see, I said finally. It's not an insult, he added quickly. It's practical. We've been looking at long-term planning lately. Retirement funds don't last forever, and with the market the way it is, I've seen markets before, I said. I know. His tone sharpened slightly, then smoothed itself out. I just think it makes more sense for us to take over now rather than later. You don't have to prove anything. Prove. That word lingered longer than the others. Is this about money, I asked quietly, or about control? His head lifted. Control? Dad, come on. I'm asking. It's about responsibility, he said. You've taken care of us for a long time. Let us take care of you. The sentence might have felt generous if it hadn't carried the faintest edge of correction. I don't need taking care of, I said. No one's saying you do. His jaw tightened. But there's nothing wrong with accepting help. I held his gaze. Daniel, I said calmly, have I ever asked you for money? No, have I ever told you I was struggling? No, but that's not the point. Then what is the point? He stood up then, pacing once across the kitchen tiles before turning back to me. The point is, I don't want you dipping into savings just to keep up appearances. Appearances. I thought of the envelope in my desk drawer. The one labeled December, the careful planning, the quiet satisfaction of giving without spectacle. I don't keep up appearances, I said. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized from his teenage years. Dad, I just don't think you can afford to host Christmas anymore. Let us handle it. It's time. Time, as if tradition expired like milk, I considered arguing. Listing numbers. Proving a point. But dignity rarely needs to shout. Instead, I nodded once. All right, I said. He blinked. All right? You host this year. Relief flooded his face so quickly it almost hurt to watch. Really? That's good. That's good, Dad. It's the smart move. Smart, I repeated. He mistook my tone for agreement. We'll handle everything, he continued. You don't need to buy gifts or anything, just come. Be with the family, not buy gifts. I stood slowly, gathering the mugs. Of course, I said. I wouldn't want to overextend myself. He didn't catch the edge in that. Or perhaps he chose not to. At the door he paused. You know this is coming from a good place, he said. I'm sure it is. After he left, I stood in the quiet kitchen for a long time. Then I walked to my desk. I opened the drawer, and I made a different kind of plan. Daniel didn't wait long to follow up. 2 days after our conversation, he called again. Dad, I've been thinking, he said. Since we're talking about planning ahead anyway, maybe it's a good time to look at everything. Just to make sure you're protected. Protected from what? I asked. Oh, you know, surprises, medical stuff. Legal things? It's easier to handle paperwork before it becomes urgent. Paperwork. He came by that Saturday with a slim leather folder tucked under his arm. He placed it carefully on the kitchen table, the way a man sets down something that carries more weight than it appears to. I spoke with an attorney friend, he began, just casually. He said it might make sense to put a durable power of attorney in place, temporary, just in case. In case of what? In case something happens and decisions need to be made quickly. Has something happened? I asked. No, but that's the point. You don't wait. He opened the folder and turned it toward me. Neat tabs, yellow highlights. My name already typed across the top of a draft document. You filled this out, I said. Just a template, he replied quickly. We'd review it together. Nothing gets signed unless you're comfortable. I read the first page slowly. Broad language, financial authority, asset management, real estate transactions. That's extensive authority, I observed. It's standard, he said. It just lets me act on your behalf if you're unable. Unable, I repeated. Dad, don't make this into something it's not. I closed the folder gently. Daniel, I said, how did we get from Christmas dinner to you managing my affairs? He exhaled sharply. It's not about managing. It's about safeguarding. You're 72. 73. Okay, 73. Things change fast at that age. I walked 3 miles this morning. That's not the point. There was a new impatience in him now, not loud but firm, as though he had already decided what was reasonable, and I was lagging behind. I just don't want you making emotional decisions, he continued, like overspending on holidays because you feel obligated. I almost smiled at that. Have I given you reason to believe I'm reckless? No, but sometimes people don't realize when they're slipping. Slipping, the word hung in the air between us. I balance my accounts every month, I said evenly. I review statements. I pay my taxes on time. I haven't missed a bill in 40 years. I know that, he said quickly. And that's great. But there's no downside to putting structure in place. There is, I said. He frowned. What downside? You begin to see me as someone who needs supervision. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. Dad, this isn't about ego. No, I said quietly. It's about perception. He was silent for a moment, then he softened his tone. Look, I'm building something, he said. You know that. I have investors now. Partners. We talk about risk management constantly. You taught me that. Plan ahead. Reduce exposure. This is the same thing. I studied him carefully. When you look at me, I asked, do you see risk? He didn't answer immediately. I see my father, he said at last. And I don't want to see you taken advantage of. Or running out of money because you didn't adjust in time. There it was again. The assumption. I appreciate the concern, I said. Truly. I slid the folder back toward him. But I'm not signing anything today. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Why not? Because I don't make decisions under subtle pressure. There is no pressure. You brought completed paperwork into my home. He looked at the folder. Then back at me. I was being proactive. And I am being deliberate. Silence settled over the table. Finally, he gathered the papers, sliding them back into the leather sleeve. Just think about it, he said. We can revisit after the holidays. Of course, I replied. At the door, he paused again. You know Melissa worries too, he added. About you being alone in this house. It's a lot to maintain. I've maintained it for decades. Maybe it's time to consider something smaller. Maybe, I said calmly. After he left, I stood by the window and watched him walk to his car. Confident stride. Phone already at his ear before he reached the driver's seat. I didn't feel anger. I felt something quieter. Replacement, as though I were being gently transitioned from decision-maker to dependent, from patriarch to liability. That afternoon, I made a few calls of my own, not reactive, not emotional, deliberate. I scheduled a meeting with an old colleague, then another with my attorney, not Daniel's friend but mine, a man who had known me long enough to understand that simplicity and weakness are not synonyms. If my son believed I needed protection, I would ensure the protection ran both directions, and I would do it without raising my voice. Christmas morning arrived. Without the usual weight of preparation. No. Folding tables dragged in from the garage, no careful unwrapping of Ellen's glass. Ornaments. No cinnamon simmering. On the stove before sunrise. Instead, I shaved, dressed in a pressed navy blazer, and placed 3 neatly wrapped gifts in the back seat of my sedan. Small boxes, modest, thoughtful. I had been instructed not to buy anything. I did anyway. Daniel's house stood at the end of a new cul-de-sac 20 minutes from mine. Larger than mine, symmetrical, 2-car garage. Wreath perfectly centered on the door, not handmade but professionally fluffed. Melissa opened the door with cheerful efficiency. Dad. Merry Christmas. She kissed my cheek, already half turned toward the kitchen. Come in, it's chaos. Inside, everything gleamed. Matching stockings. Coordinated wrapping paper. A catered breakfast arranged on warming trays. Daniel appeared from the hallway, smiling broadly. There he is, he said, clapping my shoulder. See? No stress this year. No stress, I agreed. He took my coat and hung it in a closet that smelled faintly of cedar and new paint. I stood for a moment in the foyer, adjusting to the fact that I did not know where anything was kept. The grandchildren ran past me, excited and loud. Grandpa. Noah shouted, skidding slightly on the hardwood. I knelt carefully and hugged him. You've grown since last week. "That's not possible," he said seriously. I smiled. We gathered in the living room. The tree was tall, taller than my ceiling at home, decorated in coordinated silver and blue. Beautiful in its way, but impersonal, like something assembled rather than remembered. Daniel moved through the room confidently, directing traffic. "Okay, we'll open gifts after breakfast. Dad, you just relax. Coffee's over there. Just relax." I carried my cup to an armchair slightly off-center from the main arrangement. A good vantage point, not quite inside the circle. Presents were distributed methodically. Melissa handed them out from a handwritten list. Daniel narrated small jokes about who had overspent on whom. When I quietly placed my 3 boxes beneath the tree, Daniel noticed. "Dad," he said lightly, "you didn't have to do that." I wanted to. He hesitated a fraction too long before nodding. "Well, okay. But really you shouldn't." Shouldn't. As though generosity were a budgeting error. The children tore through paper and ribbon. Laughter rose and fell in waves. I clapped when appropriate. Smiled when expected. It wasn't unpleasant. It simply wasn't mine. At one point I stepped into the hallway toward the powder room. The house was large enough that conversations drifted in pieces rather than wholes. As I passed Daniel's office, door slightly ajar, I heard my name. "Had to step in," Daniel was saying. Melissa's voice answered softer. "I know. I just didn't want to hurt his feelings." "You didn't," Daniel replied. "He needed it. He would have blown through what little he has left trying to keep up some tradition." There was a pause. "I checked Zillow," he continued. "That house of his isn't worth what he thinks. And if he keeps spending like he used to..." Melissa sighed. "He's proud." "Exactly," Daniel said. "Which is why someone has to be practical." I stood very still in the hallway, not angry, just recalibrating what little he has left. I thought of the ledger in my desk. The accounts Daniel had never asked about. The properties whose names he never noticed on documents. The quiet dividends that arrived quarterly without ceremony. I thought of the folder he'd brought to my table. Someone has to be practical. I stepped into the bathroom, ran water briefly so the pipes would explain my presence, then looked at myself in the mirror. I did not see a man slipping. I saw a man being assessed. When I returned to the living room, Daniel was laughing at something Noah had said. He looked up and caught my eye. "All good?" he asked. "All good," I replied. Soon the pile of gifts dwindled. Paper gathered in large plastic bags. The children compared toys. Daniel glanced toward the tree. "Looks like that's everything," he said. "Not quite," I answered. I stood slowly and reached behind the armchair where I had placed a flat, rectangular box wrapped in plain brown paper. "No ribbon?" Melissa teased lightly. "I've always preferred clarity," I said. Daniel chuckled, walking toward me. "Dad, you really didn't have to..." "I know," I said gently. "But this one is for you." He looked mildly uncomfortable as he took it. "What is it?" he asked. "Open it," I said. The room quieted slightly, more from curiosity than tension. He tore the paper carefully, still the cautious child when something seemed unfamiliar. Inside was a simple black folder. He frowned and began to read. 3 days before Christmas, I sat across from Richard Halpern for the first time in nearly a year. Richard is not an impressive man at first glance. Average height, gray suits that never quite match the season. But he has been my attorney for 32 years. And before that, he handled contracts for the company back when it operated out of a converted warehouse with a leaking roof. He knows the difference between performance and leverage. When I walked into his office, he studied my face for a moment longer than usual. "This isn't about estate planning," he said. "No," I replied. "It isn't." I told him everything. Not emotionally. Just facts. The conversation at my kitchen table. The folder. The words slipping. Richard listened without interrupting, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "And your son doesn't know?" he asked when I finished. "No," he leaned back slightly. "You never told him." "It wasn't necessary. 35 years ago, when Daniel was 8, I acquired a minority stake in a struggling property management firm. I didn't buy it to build an empire. I bought it because I understood buildings and the numbers made sense. Over time, the minority stake became a majority one. quietly. When Daniel graduated from college and announced he wanted to start his own management company, I didn't discourage him. I also didn't mention that the largest commercial complex he secured for his early growth was owned by a holding company that traced back, ultimately, to me. I never interfered. Never discounted rent unfairly, never sabotaged a competitor. His contracts were earned, but the foundation beneath one of his biggest revenue streams was mine, not his, Richard. Folded his hands on the desk. You're listed as majority shareholder in the holding company, he said, and sole authority on property decisions. Yes, and currently, the lease renewal for Daniel's firm is up in January. It is. Richard was quiet for a moment. What exactly are you asking me to prepare? I slid a document across his desk. I want to restructure the lease, I said. Fair market rate. Transparent terms. No informal extensions. And I want ownership documentation printed clearly. He studied me carefully. This isn't retaliation, he said. No, I replied. It's clarification. And the house? That remains in the family trust. Unchanged. He nodded slowly. You understand this will surprise him. I imagine it will. Richard allowed himself the faintest smile. You've always preferred timing over volume. I don't raise my voice, I said. I adjust the facts. 2 days later, I met with Thomas Green, the bank manager who had handled my accounts since before Daniel understood what interest meant. Thomas reviewed everything without blinking. You've been conservative, he said. Deliberately so. Yes, your liquidity alone would cover Christmas for the next 20 years. I'm aware. He looked up at me. Does your son believe you're struggling? He believes I'm on a fixed income. Thomas gave a small nod. Technically true. Just incomplete. Incomplete, I repeated. On Christmas Eve, Richard delivered the final folder to my house personally. Inside were 3 documents. Confirmation of majority ownership in the holding company. Revised lease terms effective. January 1st, a letter transferring a small but meaningful percentage of shares to Daniel, contingent on mutual transparency and respect in financial dealings, not punishment. Perspective, Richard. Paused at my doorway before leaving. You could simply tell him, he said. I could. I agreed, but you won't. No, he studied me one last time. You still want him to learn it, he said. Yes. On Christmas morning, as I sat in Daniel's armchair and watched him orchestrate his version of the holiday, I felt no anger, only certainty. When I handed him that final gift, plain brown paper, no ribbon, I wasn't exposing a secret to embarrass him. I was restoring proportion. As he opened the black folder and scanned the first page, I saw the exact moment recognition began. His eyes paused at the company letterhead, then moved down to the ownership line and stopped. Daniel didn't speak immediately. His eyes moved slowly across the page, then back to the top as if hoping he had misread the header. The room, moments earlier filled with wrapping paper and laughter, had quieted into something attentive. Melissa stepped closer. Daniel? He turned the second page. I watched his throat move as he swallowed. Dad, he said carefully, keeping his voice low. What is this? Documentation, I replied. Documentation of what? Keep reading. He did. The children sensed the shift now. Noah lowered the box of plastic parts in his lap. Ava looked between her parents. Daniel reached the signature line on the first document, the confirmation of majority ownership in Halpern Commercial Holdings. My name sat there plainly. Dated decades earlier. That's your name, he said unnecessarily. Yes. Melissa leaned in, reading over his shoulder. I saw her posture stiffen. Wait, she said softly. Halpern Holdings? That's the holding company that owns Westbridge Commons. I finished for her. Daniel looked up sharply. Westbridge Commons was his largest commercial complex. Nearly 40% of his firm's annual revenue flowed through managing that property. That's not possible, he said. It is, I replied. He flipped to the second document, the lease agreement. His eyes moved faster now. Revised terms effective January 1st, he read under his breath. Fair market adjustment. His face changed then. Not anger. Not yet. Calculation. You're increasing the lease, he said. I'm correcting it, I answered calmly. It hasn't been adjusted in years. You never said, you never asked. The silence that followed was heavier than any raised voice could have been. Melissa stepped back slightly. Absorbing the numbers, Daniel, she said quietly. This is the property. I know what it is, he snapped. Then caught himself. The children were watching now with open curiosity. Is Grandpa in trouble? Ava asked. No, I said gently. Grandpa is not in trouble. Daniel closed the folder halfway, pressing it against his palm as if containing it might change its contents. You own the majority, he said slowly. Of the holding company? Yes, since when? Since before you started your firm. He stared at me as if seeing me from a new angle. You let me believe, I let you build, I corrected. I built it, he said, a flicker of defensiveness surfacing. You did, I agreed. Your contracts, your staff, your growth strategy, all yours. But the foundation was stable. That landed harder than if I'd argued. Melissa exhaled slowly. Why didn't you tell him? I considered the question. Because I didn't want his confidence to come from me, I said. I wanted it to come from his work. Daniel's jaw tightened. And now? He asked. Now you decide to drop this on Christmas morning. I decided to respond, I said evenly. To what? I held his gaze. To being told I couldn't afford Christmas, the words did not rise. They did not need to. Melissa looked between us. Understanding dawning fully now, Daniel's expression shifted. From calculation to memory. You overheard, he said quietly. I heard enough. Color returned to his face, but not evenly. That was private, he said. It was about me. He opened the folder again, turning to the final page, the letter Richard had drafted. His eyes scanned it more slowly this time. What is this? He asked. A transfer, I said. A minority share in the holding company. Do you? He blinked. Contingent on transparency in financial matters between us, I continued, and mutual respect in future discussions about capability. Melissa covered her mouth lightly. Daniel read the clause. Again, you're giving me equity, he said. I'm formalizing. What was always intended, I replied. You will eventually oversee it all, but not because you assume I'm slipping. The children shifted uncomfortably. Noah spoke first. Dad, Daniel closed the folder gently. For the first time that morning, he did not look like the host of the house. He looked like someone reassessing the dimensions of the room. You think I was trying to take control? He said. I think, I answered carefully. You mistook simplicity for limitation. His eyes flickered. And you mistook caution for poverty. The sentence settled between us without hostility, just truth. Melissa moved quietly to guide the children toward the kitchen. Why don't we get more cocoa? She suggested softly. When they had left the room, Daniel remained standing across from me, the folder resting against his thigh. You could have just told me, he said again. But this time there was less accusation in it. Yes, I said. I could have. Why didn't you? Because you were certain. He didn't argue with that. The tree lights blinked steadily beside us. Daniel finally sat down opposite me, the black folder on the coffee table between us. For the first time in weeks, neither of us was pretending. Daniel looked at the folder for a long time before speaking. When he finally did, his voice was quieter than I had heard it all morning. Why now? Because you brought it here, I said. Not me. He shook his head slowly. I asked about hosting Christmas, about being practical. No, I met his eyes. You brought me a power of attorney, completed paperwork. Before I had said yes to anything, he opened his mouth, then closed it. I wanted you to trust me, he said. I do trust you. But trust isn't the same as surrender. He pressed his palms against his knees. You think I was trying to take over. I think, I said carefully, you believed I needed saving. And you built an entire plan around that belief without ever checking if it was true. The words landed softly but firmly. He sat back heavily against the sofa. I was trying to protect you. I know that seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. Then why? He gestured vaguely at the folder. Because protection without truth becomes control, I said. Silence. Somewhere in the kitchen, Melissa kept her voice bright for the children. The sounds of small talk drifted in but didn't penetrate the space between us. Daniel turned the folder over on the table, aligning it with the wood grain as if tidiness might steady him. "So what happens now?" he asked. "The lease resets January 1st, I said. He nodded slowly. "That's real money. It's fair market value." "I know," he paused. "I just never budgeted for it." "You will." He looked at me then, really looked at me, not through the lens of concern or control. "You let me believe you didn't have it," he said. "All those years. Watching you drive that old car. Coupons. The reminders about sales. I don't spend what I don't need to," I said. "But you didn't correct me. You didn't ask." Exhaled sharply, a sound between frustration and recognition. "This is going to make things awkward at the office," he said. "It shouldn't. It will. Only if you make it about ego." He looked up. "What would you make it about?" I considered the question carefully. "Accountability," I said. "Yours, mine, the terms are plain. The agreement is clear. The relationship between father and son doesn't change because commercial paperwork shifts." He stared at me for a long moment. "You're not angry," he said. "You're not even upset." "No, why?" I leaned forward slightly. "Because I raised a hard-working man who wanted to take care of his family," I said. "The problem isn't your intention. It's your assumption." He took that in without arguing. "You want me to tell you what you did wrong," I continued. "But the truth is simpler. You looked at the surface of my life and decided you understood it. That's not cruelty, Daniel. It's just incompleteness." He blinked. "I didn't want to see you struggle," he said quietly. "I wasn't struggling. I thought you were. No." The children's laughter broke. From the kitchen, bright and unself-aware, Daniel's shoulders lowered slightly. "What about the share transfer?" he asked. "It stands," I said, "even after what you heard?" "Especially after what you heard," he frowned. "It's not a reward," I explained. "It's a responsibility. You can't assume my incapacity and claim my assets without also accepting the truth of how they were built." He sat with that. "So you're giving me a lesson." "I'm giving you equity," I said. "What you do with the lesson is up to you." He almost smiled. "Almost. The lease adjustment," he said slowly. "That's the consequence. That's the correction. In 60 days, I'll figure it out. I know you will." He looked at me then with something unfamiliar in his expression. "You always knew I would," he said. "I always knew you could." The quiet between us shifted. Les waited. Melissa appeared at the doorway, 2 mugs of cocoa in hand. "Is everything okay?" she asked carefully. Daniel stood up. "Everything's fine," he said. "Dad and I were just settling some business." She looked at me. I nodded once. She smiled, and tentative but genuine, and disappeared back toward the kitchen. Daniel looked down at me. "I'm sorry for what you overheard," he said. "It wasn't right. I appreciate that. And I'm sorry for the folder. I understand it." He hesitated as if wanting to say something more, then simply nodded. That was enough. The house felt especially quiet when I returned home that afternoon. Not lonely, just settled. Hung my blazer in the hallway closet and placed the now empty black folder on my desk. Outside, the maple tree in the yard stood bare against a pale winter sky. The neighborhood was still, families inside, finishing meals, assembling toys, napping in warm rooms. For the first time in weeks, I felt no anticipation, only clarity. Daniel called 2 days later, not out of obligation. "I could hear that much. Are you busy?" he asked. "No. I've been going over the numbers. I assumed you would." There was a faint exhale on the other end. "I can absorb the lease increase," he said. "It tightens margins, but it's manageable. I'll restructure 2 service contracts and delay expansion on the east side." "That sounds prudent." A pause. "You've been charging below market for years." "Yes." "Why?" "Because you were new. And because stability matters more than squeezing every dollar." He was quiet at that. "I never noticed," he said. "I know." Another pause. "Longer this time I should have asked," he admitted. "Yes," I said. "You should have." There was no accusation in it. Just agreement. We spoke for nearly an hour that afternoon. Not about childhood memories or hurt feelings. About projections. staffing models, capital reserves. It reminded me of conversations we had when he was fresh out of college and hungry to understand how risk worked. Except this time, there was less impatience in him, less certainty. In the weeks that followed, small changes unfolded. Daniel withdrew the power of attorney draft. He told me so directly. I deleted the template, he said. I don't want it sitting on my computer like a loaded assumption. That choice mattered more than the document ever. And he also asked, carefully, if I would be willing to review his long-term expansion strategy once a quarter as an advisor, he clarified, not as oversight. I would like that, I said. Melissa came by on her own one afternoon with a tin of leftover cookies. I hope you know we never meant to make you feel diminished, she said. I wasn't diminished, I replied gently. Just misread. She nodded, absorbing that. I think sometimes we see what scares us, she admitted. Daniel's terrified of financial instability. He works so hard to outrun it. I know, I said. She hesitated. He learned that from you, she added. Perhaps he had. I have always believed that fear, when properly disciplined, can build remarkable things. But left unexamined, it can also rewrite the narrative in ways that aren't entirely fair. The share transfer was finalized in January. Daniel insisted on reviewing every clause himself this time, not because he distrusted me, but because he understood now that clarity protects both directions. When the documents were signed, he looked at me across Richard's polished conference table. I thought success meant being the one in control, he said. And what do you think now? I asked. I think it means knowing who actually holds the weight. Richard pretended not to hear that. At home, I left my routines unchanged. I still drive the same silver sedan. It still starts every morning. I still clip coupons, though not as many as Daniel assumes. And this December, Christmas will return to my house, not because I proved I could afford it, but because Daniel asked. I'd like the kids to know where it started, he said last week. If you're willing, I am, I replied. There was no ceremony in that decision. No grand apology delivered at the doorstep, just adjustment. The grandchildren will unfold the long wooden table again. The glass ornaments Ellen loved will catch the light from the window, the way they always have. Melissa has already asked for the gingerbread recipe. And this time, she asked before rearranging the spice cabinet. As for Daniel, he has begun to ask different kinds of questions. Not, can you afford this? But how did you decide that? That distinction matters. I have spent most of my life understanding something that took my son a little longer to see. Wealth is not loud. It doesn't argue. It doesn't posture. It doesn't rush to correct every misconception. It waits. There is a particular danger in confusing restraint with weakness, in assuming that a quiet man is an incapable one. In believing that simplicity signals scarcity, Daniel made that mistake, but he corrected it, and that is what matters. On New Year's Eve, he stopped by unannounced, the way he used to. He let himself in. I was at the kitchen table reviewing a quarterly statement. He glanced at the papers, then at me. You know, he said, for a man who couldn't afford Christmas, you run a pretty disciplined operation. I looked up. For a man who tried to take over his father's finances, I replied, you've adjusted well. He smiled fully then. Fair enough. We stood there for a moment in comfortable quiet. Dad, he said finally, I'm glad you let me open that gift. So am I answered. Because the truth is, the folder was never about the lease or the shares. It was about proportion.
About reminding my son, gently, that stewardship is not inherited through assumption. It is earned through understanding. Christmas morning did not end in shouting or humiliation. It ended in recalibration. And sometimes that is the most valuable gift a father can give. After all, money can be counted. Dignity cannot.